to all of the organizers, certainly to the Faculty des Lettres et des Sciences Humaines, and a special thank you to الأستاذ because who has been quite a guide for me during my time here in Morocco. So, in his devastating attack on Greek philosophy, the Tahafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali exposed and attempted to refute the Aristotelian notion, favored by the Falasifa, that God had knowledge only of universals, not of particulars. This argument amounts to the idea that God's knowledge, like God himself, must be perfect and unchanging. Of course, it could not therefore be particular, because to have knowledge of particulars, then Zaid, and not just man, is to have changing knowledge. Zaid changes, man, as universal man, does not. Beyond that, of course, knowledge of particulars is also sensory, requires the senses, and that requires a body, and God does not have a body. To Al-Ghazali, though, this notion is both logically incoherent. Ghazali claims if one kind of knowledge can be denied of God, then so can another kind. So if God does not have knowledge of particulars, then maybe God also does not have knowledge of universals. So it's logically incoherent, it doesn't work. But it also cannot work with the Muslim God. For if God does not know particulars, then man, who does know particulars, would have more knowledge than God, and this is surely unbelief. Beyond that, if God does not know particulars of human activities, then God cannot judge sin. He doesn't know when humans are sinning. So it's difficult to overstate the importance of this question for someone like Ibn Rushd, who is, of course, both Muslim and an Aristotelian philosopher. If the idea is that the philosophical demonstration that God could not have knowledge of particulars is in conflict with a religious belief, then we have a real problem for the philosopher who writes, for example, the Fasl al-Maqal, to harmonize the Sharia and Hikmah. So, writing a generation after Al-Ghazali's attack on Falsafa, Ibn Rushd proposes the following solution to the problem. This is from the Damima, which is like an epistle dedicatory to Fasl al-Maqal, as I'm sure you all know. Ibn Rushd states that God's knowledge is a knowledge the quality of which nobody but God himself can understand, end quote. So it's neither universal nor particular. Rather, the case for eternal, that is divine knowledge, with respect to existence, is different from the case for generated or human knowledge with respect to existence. That is because existence is the cause and reason of our, that is human knowledge, while eternal knowledge, divine knowledge, is the cause and reason of existence. So, end quote. God's knowledge is simply different in kind from ours, and we have to content ourselves with that. Now, importantly, as I'll discuss in the paper, Ibn Rushd also reiterates this argument in his commentary on the metaphysics, the grand commentary, the large commentary, the long commentary on the metaphysics. This is one of his later works, and is also one that is directed at other philosophers, not more at the general public or as more of a religious, I call it Islamic writing. So he's written the same idea that God's knowledge is simply of another kind in both his Islamic writings as well as in his philosophical writings. Now, on the one hand, this solution, such as it is, it does avoid the problem that God's knowledge of, or lack of knowledge of particulars poses, right? On the other hand, if indeed the nature of God's knowledge is just unknowable, and God's knowledge is the source, is the reason and source of our existence, then as a philosopher, he's left with very little to investigate, right? Everything can sort of be this mystery, which is not the rational and burhani commitment that Ibn Rushd has. So, has Ibn Rushd really discovered a solution to this perennial problem concerning the nature of God's knowledge of particulars versus universals? This is what my paper is attempting to investigate. So, to sort of explain what this position is, what Ibn Rushd's argument is, he writes that this divine causal knowledge, he writes about this multiple times throughout the Damima, throughout the Tahafut al-Tahafut, his response to the Tahafut al-Falasifa, and there's a statement in the Tahafut al-Tahafut that I think explains his position well, and I'll read it in full, though there are many others to this effect, especially in the Tahafut al-Tahafut. It is impossible, writes Ibn Rushd, according to the philosophers, that God's knowledge should be analogous to ours, for our knowledge is the effect of the existence, that is a mawjudat, not existence, singular, the plural. whereas God's knowledge is the existence cause. And it is not true that eternal knowledge is of the same form as temporal knowledge, human knowledge. He who believes this would make God an eternal man and man a mortal God. And in short, it has been shown that God's knowledge stands in opposition to man's, for it is God's knowledge which produces the existence, and it is not the existence which produces God's knowledge. So it's important to note again that these are works of dialectic, and Ibn Rushd makes clear, even in his very works of dialectic, or what I call his Islamic writings, that these do not rise to the level of Burhan, right? These are not truly philosophical works, they are dialectical works. Still, he repeats this seemingly undemonstrative position, this غير Burhan, right, position, in one of his Kutub al-Burhan, the long commentary on metaphysics, book Lambda. And here, again, there are several quotes. There's one that is particularly important, and I will read selectively from it. The truth, Ibn Rushd writes, the truth is that because it, the first intellect, this is, so it's God, but in Aristotelian terms, because it, the first intellect, knows only itself. It knows the existence through the existence, which is the cause of their existences. Likewise, the first, subhanahu, is he who knows absolutely the nature of being, qua being, which is his essence. Therefore, the word knowledge is said of his knowledge and our knowledge, divine knowledge and human knowledge, only by homonymy. It's the same word but different meanings. For his knowledge, God's knowledge, is the cause of being, and being is the cause of our knowledge. And his knowledge, God's knowledge, cannot be described as universal, nor as particular. God is not characterized by the knowledge which is in us, nor by the ignorance which is its opposite, etc., etc. So again, this is a more elaborate argument for his assertion in his Islamic writings that God's knowledge is simply of another kind, and it cannot be put fully into human terms. So does this position work, and does it solve this problem of God's knowledge of particulars? I'll deal with just a few scholars who have attempted to understanding this. Tahaz and Barry Cogan have both treated this position at some length, and both are skeptical that this can actually work as an argument. Barry Cogan does do his best to present it as working. He writes, while one could conceive of a fully actualized intelligence, such as this first intellect of Aristotle that is a stand-in for God, such an intelligence would know all of the existence actually and grasp the totality of their forms and interrelations together, and yet would know everything in terms of content that humans know only partially. So we could imagine this, we could conceive of this, but there are two problems. First, this fully actualized intelligence could not be simple, and it must be simple, right? Both for Aristotle and for the Muslim God, for various reasons that we probably don't have time for, but it must be simple. And this kind of intelligence could not be simple. So Cogan says that Ibn Rushd could maybe get around this problem because he presents this first intellect as nothing more than God's unimpeded and uninterrupted act of thinking the forms of the existence. It's essentially going to be the unmoved mover of Aristotle. This simplicity is ultimately permitted, even though this intellect would have multiple kinds of knowledge, because God lacks matter. And so, to Cogan's version of Ibn Rushd, this could still be a simple intellect with this continuous kind of thinking, various kinds of knowledge, but it is a single act, as it were, of thinking. And because it lacks matter, this is still a simple and complete being. So that's the first problem, and Cogan sees it as possibly resolvable. The second problem, though, is that even such whole and perfect knowledge could not be causative. It could not bring about our existence in the way that Ibn Rushd has suggested that it would. Cogan attempts to resolve this problem by identifying Ibn Rushd's first intellect, God, with Aristotle's unmoved mover, although it's one that really resembles Plotinus's nous. It's much more one of emanation than one of sort of pure intellect, than Aristotle's pure first intellect, in which God's knowledge is a cause in the sense that it is both formal, It knows all of the forms, as the first principle does for Aristotle, but also final. It is a final cause in that it is directing everything towards its completion. So this is how Kogan sees Ibn Rushd's argument as maybe holding together that you can have a purely simple intellect that can know everything, not both particulars and universals, in a way that is different from the way we speak of humans' knowledge of universals and particulars. The problem here for Kogan is that while you can see that this could be both simple and knowing all things, it still cannot really be causal unless we're speaking of something that is not really knowledge, he says. So in short, he says, when the theory of divine causal knowing is recognizably epistemic, it is not causal. When it is causal, it is not epistemic. So he has done his best to see if this can work in a philosophic sense, and Kogan concludes it really can't. Briefly, Thérèse Andriot agrees. She says, Ibn Rushd has proposed, after a long analysis, a clever but rather unsatisfactory answer to the problems raised by God's knowledge of anything outside of himself. Even if God is a metaphysician, and therefore metaphysics is the divine way of knowing, it still does not ensure true knowledge of things here below. In other words, even if God is necessarily the creator, maybe there is this sort of metaphysical way of knowing, but it still doesn't work for Girard that kind of being would know the particulars of life here on earth. So, my own argument, despite the apparent consensus that Ibn Rushd's position simply does not work, and to these commentators on Ibn Rushd, the conclusion is that he's maybe doing something else here, which I'll get to. My own position is that we should, maybe ought, must take Ibn Rushd seriously when he states categorically and repeatedly that we cannot understand fully the nature of God's knowledge. In other words, Kogan's objection that God's knowledge cannot be understood in ways that are both causal, that cause our existence, and also epistemic, that are really knowledge, rather than detracting from Ibn Rushd's point, that actually illustrates the point. Ibn Rushd is saying, yes, both of these things must be true. It is a paradox. We cannot understand it. Now, this is, again, it returns to the problem I stated at the beginning. If this is what we're left with, is this sort of lack of ability to understand, it's not an especially philosophical answer. Still, I want to call attention to the language surrounding Ibn Rushd's treatment of divine causal knowledge in the long commentary on the metaphysics, which is, again, one of his works of Burhan. There's something quite distinct about just this section of the commentary, where he discusses the nature of God's knowledge. So, by contrast to what I will explain, the standard treatment of God in the commentary on Metaphysics Lambda is that of a commentator on Aristotle. He quotes Aristotle, often line by line, and then he comments on the works by way of explaining them, elucidating them, surely adding some of his own interpretation, but it's quite strict. It's quite strictly a commentary. And these interpretations elsewhere in the commentary do indeed deal in questions of divinity. He speaks of the gods, the deity, as well as copious references to the intellect, the first mover, etc. So it's not that he's avoiding the same topic. The same topic occurs throughout. However, at the point at which Ibn Rushd makes his statement on the nature of divine knowledge, the one where he says, the truth is that because this intellect, the first intellect, knows only itself, it knows the existence through the existence, which is the cause of their existence. This part is marked by three important indicators that I think suggest a key to understanding Ibn Rushd in this section. First, it's the only instance in the entire commentary on the Metaphysics Lambda, apart from the very closing, but the only part in the text itself, at which Ibn Rushd refers to God with the Subhanahu. And he uses it twice, once after al-awwal, and then shortly after that to describe his knowledge. So this is the only part where he's using this Islamic honorific. Secondly, after he uses the first, al-awwal, secondly, he uses this term, al-awwal, to describe this intellect, rather than any of the other terms he has been using, the divine, the deity, etc. So he seems only to be using al-awwal in this section of the commentary on Metaphysics Lambda. However, al-awwal is the term that he uses throughout the Tahafut, which is where he is explicitly discussing God. Right? This is an Islamic work. This is where he is attempting to discuss Islamic theology and philosophy. So I think the al-awwal as well as the subhanahu are meant to be some kind of indication of how we read this part. And finally, he introduces this statement with the expression, the truth is, al-haq hu, I think, which itself appears only in one other place in the commentary Metaphysics Lambda, where he speaks of God's providence, and God's providence is closely related to God's knowledge of universals and particulars. Without God's knowledge of particulars, it is difficult to see God's providence, right? So the truth is used only at this section and one other section on God's providence. So the overall effect of this section of the commentary Metaphysics Lambda suggests that he is now going to speak not about the God of the philosophers, but specifically about the Islamic God. And that he's speaking not only as a commentator, though also that, not only as a commentator on Aristotle, but in his own voice. So again, I suggest that this position on divine causal knowledge must be taken seriously as his actual position, even if Ibn Rushd was aware of its tenuous philosophical status, that it is difficult, as we saw with Kogan's attempt, it's difficult to make this coherent as a philosopher. Still, God is not, he insists over and over in various ways, a, quote, eternal man. He is something different, not different by degree, but different in kind. Man is finite, God is eternal, he is outside of time. Therefore, we should not expect God's knowledge to be understood by way of analogy to our own, because God is not analogous to us in so many ways. Rather, perhaps, Ibn Rushd is employing both the rationalism of Aristotelian philosophy as well as a rationalism of the Islamic faith. When we read the commentary on the Metaphysics Lambda alongside Ibn Rushd's remarkably similar statements in his, what I call Islamic works, even as Taliaferro acknowledges, we may see the possibility that Ibn Rushd is speaking of a God, as Gerard writes, knowing particulars in another mode of knowing, that there is another kind of knowledge, just not just knowing more, but a different kind of knowledge, another mode. In other words, that the knowledge that is conveyed in religion is not wholly of a kind with that is conveyed through philosophy, or at least Burhan. It's a controversial thesis. So it must be admitted that the evidence I've given for what I interpret as Ibn Rushd's seriousness here could actually work against my own argument. Richard Taylor Genquant, who translated this, as well as Gerard, read his texts as, they say, trying to hide, as is Gerard's words, trying to hide radical claims offensive to religious feelings. In other words, they see this as a position that the problem of God's knowledge of particulars is an inevitable philosophical problem that cannot be resolved with religion. Ibn Rushd is aware of that, and he's just trying to hide it. And that perhaps could be, and now I am adding this, that perhaps could be why he uses like subhanahu, why he says al-awwal, why he's using these other indicators. So that is entirely possible. Nevertheless, the entire principle that Ibn Rushd's dialectical and persuasive works reveal, or Islamic works, reveal less, or at least less directly, his own true position than do his Burhani works. This is a principle we get from his dialectical, his Islamic works. I think we could also consider taking from one of those dialectical works, the principle that God's knowledge is unknowable to us. That is, if we are going to take him seriously when he says this is not, that the Burhani works are where the truth really lies, we take that idea from a work of dialectic. So why should we not also take from it the idea that God's knowledge is just different from ours? To close, this idea of the unique and unknowable nature of God's knowledge seems to have been so important to Ibn Rushd's thought of Islamic Aristotelianism that he was willing to assert it to philosophers who may have known better. As he reminds us, though, at the end of the Fasl al-Maqal, philosophy, Falsafah, or actually hikmah, is the companion of the Sharia and its milk sister. That is, they are nourished from the same source, which, as he reminds us at the end both of the epistle dedicatory and the commentary on the metaphysics, this source is God, the giver of intelligence and wisdom. And thank you very much.